Guido, can I call you Guido? Is that the best?
Yes, of
All right,
course.
good. And can you kind of tell us where you are right now?
I'm in Woodland Hills, LA
Awesome.
County. Yeah.
How are the firefires this summer? Did they
Oh
influence you a
yeah,
lot?
yeah. Intense,
Okay,
intense.
I
But
bet.
everything's cleared now. Beautiful
Good,
day.
good. Hey, I wonder if we could begin by you kind of oh, in a summary that you think would work. How would you describe kind of your background, the influences that led you to where you are now, and your intellectual heroes, and then kind of your intellectual project, that tree you're barking up?
Okay. Well, I don't know. I the background is kind of coming from a lay European family. Actually, I mean, Catholics. I went through catechism and all, but I guess the orientation in the family was very more on the lay side. We were not really involved with the church at the time at all. And my father was a physicist, and at the time, and so grew up Cold War. We were very much on the right wing, super pro-America, pro-Israel, anti-communist, um, pro-church with Catholic roots and all that. Then when the wall, and so that's what I grew up with, although it was not very intense, but the message was that. And then when the wall came down, everything turned. My dad became a Marxist. My mother turned a green environmentalist, and I didn't know what to do. I was pretty much listening to the Who all the time. So I, I didn't. I was, and my outlook was more that of a tsetse fly. I just like to, bother people and being sarcastic. That was just me. And then, so nothing really interesting until then I started studying, and then when I started studying political economy and all those things, I just, so I kind of grew up a bit, and, and I just realized that all the things that I learned in catechism, things that been taught at home, you got to do this, you got to embrace peace and do good and do right. And so I just realized that once I came and studied in the States and also through economics in Rome, that I don't know, I just kind of came out of the familial ivory tower and realized that that everybody was not that naive, that everybody was kind of attuned to the cynical game, and I just kind of stuck to the vision that I was told, but realizing that it was just rigid and that things just don't work that way. But so it's not that I just started to see myself as some kind of a hero of virtue at all, but I just realized that, well, they taught us all these things, and how isn't that anybody is not respecting them? They taught us that violence is wrong, but they taught us violence is wrong, but I see violence and violence and bullying and exercise at every level, but in subtle ways. It doesn't have to be brutal at all. And in Europe, there's that kind of machismo, bullying, arm-toting thing. It doesn't exist, but nevertheless, it's exactly the same thing. And so I was just puzzled all of a sudden, and so because I never saw myself, as I said, as some kind of a soapbox orator and pointing the direction of virtue. It was absurd. But all of a sudden, it's like, well, I mean, we were taught a certain thing, and it's and in economics, it was clear. We were taught Austrian economics in our sociological classes, where the message was, and I was completely seduced at first of it, only to realize shortly after a while that it was just absurd. This whole thing that there's a market that some kind of impersonally organizes things, and if you make it, and the market gives you the opportunity, and if you make it, that's a sign that your tenacity has paid off. And all those who are poor and unsuccessful are clearly people that have been penalized by an efficient process of allocation of talents and so on and so forth. So I realized this is just nonsense. It's kind of a Kafka game of the lawyers in our cells that are telling us to suppress the pangs of conscience of just being born on the privileged side of the fence. Mm-hmm. So I developed a profound disgust after I had this realization for this Austrian approach, who attracts still religiously, because scientifically it has nothing, but religiously it attracts still so many minds and hearts. I said to myself, this is garbage. And after that, I went radical all the way, just realizing that all the curriculum that was being taught was just nothing but an endless justification of the fact that, whatever is right, and the conservative motto. So anything to justify the powers, the distribution of wealth and the power structure that is. So people would say to me, well, good, it took you so many years to figure that out? And the answer is, well, yes, it did. Because it did.
Yeah. Well, interesting. We're going to kind of talk about that compassionate tradition, but as a kind of a precursor, you said your dad was a physicist. Was that Giuliano Preparata?
Yes, that was.
Okay. Fascinating. And I think that if my reading of your work is right, that shows up in your work, kind of that background, but we'll kind of come to that. So
great influence.
Yeah, I bet. So I want to, I'm a father of 4 children. I've worked at colleges, I've taught in high school. Yeah, you're right about this kind of downloaded competitive ideology we're handed, but we take it as reality, Guido. Like, how would you convince somebody, and we'll bring up the name Darwin, your reaction to that, but how would you convince somebody that what you're talking about, when so much of your work is about a compassionate tradition of brotherhood and justice that is kind of taken axiomatically as the foundation of any economics courses and so forth, how would you, in all intelligence, tell somebody that it's not just pie in the sky?
Well, I mean, this is true for everything. You go there and you have mission statements in schools and this and that, and the political pronouncements and the political rhetoric. It's all about love. It's not about love. It's about cooperation, doing the right thing. It's just, it's rhetoric. Darwin. Well, Darwin, what does Darwin say? That everything is due to every development is generated and due to random mutations that are just reinforced by through natural selection into surviving types. And I don't know, and I think, and everybody just mocks, the old myths of creation, not just the Judeo-Christian, all of them. The modern mind is to make fun of this. Oh yes, there was a snake at the beginning. Oh yes, the hand of God. Ha ha ha. They read, and I understand, of course, they're metaphorical, and who knows what they really hide. And I say, okay, they're childish. But that's childish. And you think, instead of thinking that everything began with just an act of chance, and then all of this came about, and that's even worse. It's even funnier in a sense. It's even more ridiculous. It's even less imaginative compared to that myth. Your myth, the Darwin myth. The others are like super evolved. So I don't know what you're laughing about. And in the end, it's not even that. I mean, if you look at the Darwinian myth, what is it? It's just a celebration, a eulogy of the British Empire. Who was it that had not a chance in hell in the 1500s to emerge among these great kingdoms that was already there? England herself. And she did it. It was a miracle. Maybe taking advantage of the strife that was taking place on the continent. As the story goes, they imported know-how. And then under Elizabeth, they created their intelligence services and then their fleet, and achieved the impossible. In fact, everybody, including Hitler, were awed by this thing. And yeah, it's amazing, but we all speak English, and the triumph is complete. And hats off, you did it. Well, whether you, the British elite, are good stewards for this earth, no, I absolutely don't think so. But in terms of power management, you are number one. And prophet and Darwin is one of your prophets. I don't think there's anything scientific to what he said. Maybe very vaguely, not anything that's been said by others. The mutation, everybody understood the word mutation, but the question is what drives those mutations and what he did. And this, I'm not a biologist, but I'm on solid ground on this, because as a political economist, we knew where he got that from. He got it from Malthus, that there's not enough food, and the strife for competition, the scarcity drives it. And that's also another myth, not even original to Malthus, who wrote that horrendous book on population, which was plagiarized anyway. So yeah, but that's the religion. So. And that was on what, the 10-pound bill. So this is a new religion, and it's that kind of creed. And I don't think so. In the end, it's all about a battle of religions, and I don't think that the Darwinian creed is a good creed. But yeah, it's based on violence. It's the belief is natural selection is a celebration of violence. But even the founder of criminology, Lombroso, whom I great admire, is a great scientist, but also him posited the alpha of this world as crime. Nature is violent, nature is crafty and evil in a sense. And because they all, and this goes back to the problem of how did this all start? How do we reconcile good into evil into a good rational plan for this universe we have? And so most people are confident saying that it all started with crime, and then say that in the light of crime, the best we can do is through some kind of nurture that we have in us, God knows how, we're going to try to correct it. But it's all in all, it's always, whatever we see it, there's always an acceptance and a resignation to the fact that we are a violent species. And I reject that. I see the violence, but I think we can overcome it. And I think where we have to work is in the psyche. We have to re-educate ourselves completely. It can be done, but it's complicated. But it's what some people that have noticed this too are calling reprogramming, and some have saying that reprogram ourselves is going to be impossible. What is right now is that we have this propensity for the Holocaust. We do for the hecatomb. We are more prone to killing one another, despite our pronouncements, than make this world a good proposition for peace and cooperation. If I can condense it.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that. Do you see evidence of a more compassionate time in history, or if you want to even bring that to kind of a discussion of another stream, the stream that you follow, who began it, where did it start? And I'm talking about some of your intellectual heroes like Marcel Mauss, Thorstein Veblen, Karl Polanyi. If you can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Well, I don't know if at any time in history there was. I'm sure. I mean, I guess that's what a lot of historians have do, or find those periods, and they celebrate them as. And you find them in Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound is highly controversial, yes, but who study periods of history and they say, this was a great time for this, or I'm talking especially about monetary reform in a time where money was handled more harmoniously and virtuously than others. But my heroes, I don't know, a book that's really important for me and I think should be read by everyone is Tolstoy's Confessions. I think it's because Tolstoy is, I think it's really the encapsulation. It's really the in a sense, it's the dramatization of everything we're talking about. It is a man, and then we can discuss whether he was really a degenerate who was mean to his wife and never succeeded in doing what he wanted to do. I don't know, maybe, but at least in what he's trying to write is a man who was born a nobleman with all the psychological apparatus of a predator, and he describes, I mean, all of it, just what a disgusting thing it is, and then he realizes it and spends the rest of his life trying to, as if it were some kind of an outgrowth and an excrescence of flesh around his head, he tears it away from him violently. And this is what it's about. He despoils himself as his possession, gives it to his peasants, talks about how he his characters are these noblemen who violated maids or then prostituted themselves, and then feel so completely devastated and wants to redeem themselves and wanting to help and failing and so on. And then the war and so on. So it's what you need to do in order to get rid of this program that we have in us, which makes the predatory instinct, which is repulsive, the strongest in us. And it's about, what do I do to tear it away from me? And in the Confessions, he talks about faith and what your creed is, and he makes this statement. He says, once you believe, you decide to believe and you decide what's right, and then you have to be a real believer, to uphold this credence, you have to uphold it to the extreme consequences. In other words, this is what Melville said, you're a patriot only to heaven. And that means that you have to sacrifice to this belief in the name of the right, everything else, which means the flag, which we could say, well, no problem. The clan, and for some more complicated, and ultimately the family too. If it goes against it, you have to be, you sacrificing means you have to, it's not you have to do anything drastic, but you have to renounce, or you have to put that above everything else. And we know the family is on the one hand is so important, but in the name of the family to, and we see this in a million films and books, to protect the child who has done a misdeed, the parents are able to will have to cover all sorts of crimes if. But that's what it is in a sense. What is most important, and you have to, so that, and all it brings all these points there, and a critique of the predator mentality, which brings us into the important questions.
Yeah, and at least Tolstoy laid it out bare there, you know.
Yes,
And what you're saying about the family at least passes the smell test vis-a-vis how it passes in the gospel too. It seems to be one and the same. You know, Jesus says, leave your father and mother behind.
yes.
You know, at least it's there. Yeah, I appreciate that. How about a little bit more about an intellectual genealogy of this other subversive tradition, I would say. Who else is part of this genealogy? How can we trace it? Where do we find it?
Well, for me, I was in search of a book that could change my life. I should definitely say that Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class did that. When I read it, I was already in grad school, but I finally said, "Oh, finally!" Not it was just finally a great book, but it's about this. It's a battle between the nurture, deep down behind this highly sophisticated Latinized English language of his, and its anthropological investigation. This just genius, Veblen. It outlines it's a moral book about, which says in the end, roughly, that world is divided between, the world is, we as a species, 80% of us are wired strongly in a predatory way, and another is by chance bred at 20% nurture. This explains why violence predominates. Why? He doesn't explain. Nobody's capable. And it's all a book showing you the ridiculousness and the absurdity of the leisure class that comes from this, manifesting the fact that you are a parasite, and that you have, and you flaunt it and show it in conspicuous fashion, that you have unlimited time, or you have much time and money that you can splurge because you don't do anything and everybody else works for you. But it's much deeper than that, and it's a declension of all of these things through our dress, the activities, the professions, and so it's, for me, the greatest book of social science ever written. I mean, not that I've read them all, but I've read many, and there's nothing like it. And so that really was really important. Then I would say the natural economic order by Silvio Gesell, who is not a scholar. But there is the whole idea that money should die. It's another thing which really hit me with like lightning.
And we're definitely going to get into that later too, but talk about it a little now.
Yeah, I know this. Yeah, we'll talk. I mean, it's a simple. I wish I'd thought that idea. It's just genial idea. And I say, I mean, and then Rudolf Steiner is probably another one who had also great influence on me. He's mesmerizing, and I don't know, his demonology and all sorts of, and economically he was aligned with these other things. So I would say these three have made a strong impression on me.
I've read a lot of Steiner myself, and if you wanted to convince somebody to read him, you know, they're going to come against so many obstacles. We both have to admit right away. What would be, how would you inspire somebody to kind of wade into Steiner's corpus, and maybe where?
Well, I mean, what's hardest for me, what the biggest skepticism would be, is when he talks about those records that he mines with his clairvoyant vision. People are going to say, well, maybe, but how do I know it's true? You know, he gives you this, you know, in outlines of the spiritual science, he talks about how the cosmos were and these different reincarnations. It's like almost sci-fi scenarios. And he's really serious. He's that serious and earnest about these visions he had. And when people hear about visions, they go, "Oh well." But then I would say, all right, well, let's go to the more concrete. I would just point to the more concrete. His readings. I would say definitely you could just talk about some of the economics, a lot of the science, pharmacology, and And certain people will immediately jump at it because it's so imaginative and so powerful. And I've used it in my criminology classes when he talks about how the different bodies of the human body mesh, and how when there are some mismatches, you get neurotic or strange behaviors, and that could explain the ecstatic types down to those who commit atrocities, or what we call serial killers, which are not a modern phenomenon. I remember reading Steiner in my criminology courses, and I don't remember anybody laughing at all. So there are various ways of plugging him in.
Yeah.
It can be done. It can
Yeah.
be done. Sure.
It's difficult, but I agree it can be done.
It's difficult, it's about overcoming the prejudices that have already been set up. I mean, we have to think that when we and the kids that go through a conventional curriculum in the schools that are shaped in a very particular way, they are conditioned. Mm-hmm. They're taught to have skepticism versus certain things and not others. So the battle for the mind, but there are ways of reversing it. It has to do with education and how people are formed, of course.
Yeah, yeah. One of the battle for the mind. One of the little, I suppose, one little area where, if you want to flip these two things, you can go in completely different ways. But power and economics. It seems like amongst my peers, about 80% would say, it's the big banks and economics and people's desire for money which drives the whole thing. Your point of view is going to give much more to power over economics. Can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah. Well, this is also very much, it's a classic, and this is what explains to a large degree the success of Marxism. It's because and it's a convenient way, and I think the elite loves it because it deflects your people's attention from where power and decisions are really made. So it's convenient to blame the bankers for everything and say it's all an economic thing. It's all about making money, but it's not just a decoy. I mean, it's complete nonsense, because when you look at the people, the actors in the game, they're already so extraordinarily rich that they wouldn't even able to know how to spend all the money they have if they were to reincarnate 16 times. So it's obviously not the money. And a study of sociology will tell you that the most important thing is status, for one. If you really want to remain at the sociological level, people vie for status, and money is the biggest vector in that way. But it's not about making more money. So yeah, and so they encourage you to think, and also in more political terms, they encourage you to think it's the bankers because. And it's great because people who have patriotic allegiances don't have to put them in question, right? It's all you can blame them, but you can blame the bankers. But no, I think if you try to study history and from the economic angle, and that's what Polanyi does in the second part of his book, you end up saying either nothing or going completely astray, because that's not what drives it at all. Yeah. Central bankers and financiers and all that are very important lieutenants, but they're an auxiliary corps of very high level, but they're not the ones who make decisions. And you will see this all the time wherever you go. There might be cases where wars were conducted for maybe economic reasons, but most of the big ones had absolutely nothing to do with economics. They had to do with the recomposition, reconfiguration of world domination. And there's a decision that are taken not by bankers who don't have that kind of experience, but by the diplomatic corps and the governmental circles that have been playing this game for centuries. They know what to do. They understand economics too. And then they have these economic generals, to implement those policies whenever needed. And nothing exemplifies this, but there are infinite cases than the things that I've studied in my Hitler book, and the role of Montague Norman at the Bank of England. Yeah. He was a steward of the highest level, but it's not. The Montague Norman did this and he financed the Nazis. It was not. You got to be extremely naive or extremely in bad faith to think that that's the case.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to your book, Conjuring Hitler, and I want to just highlight. You've mentioned two authors, two books so far, and if listeners didn't pick it up, Thorstein Veblen, an American from the Midwest. Economist in the theory of the leisure class. You also mentioned Karl Polanyi and his book, The Great Transformation. And so I see this kind of interview going in two loops, if you will, and we're still in the first one. And I'd like to move from this, your ideas about what we might call an Apollonian world, an Apollonian possibility. And then you wrote an excellent book. The first one we're going to talk about is The Ideology of Tyranny. It was actually after the Conjuring Hitler book. But seminal to that is you find current power politics, certainly a lot of academia, and so much else being beholden to what you call, a politics of diversity, an ideology or a politics of discord. And what you do is you trace something that many, many people trace back to Michel Foucault. You trace it back further. Can you tell us who you trace it to? Can you tell us about this person? And can you tell us some of the ramifications of that?
Yeah. I remember when political correctness came into being. We're talking in the early 80s, so on. And at first, and I tell the story in the book, it made people laugh, especially Europeans, because there was, I don't know, there was something surreal about it. It's like, okay, now you're forbidding certain words, but you think that the evil is going to go away because you cannot say those words anymore. I mean, this is really childish. And but it was with typical European snobbery. I mean, one had completely underestimated because the project was a lot more sophisticated. And so I trace all the story, and I think what elites are really obviously are really worried about is because they are so few and they suck up so much resources parasitically from the rest of them. They have to be in solid psychological control of people who work for them, because they're so completely outnumbered that they have got to create and manipulate the mind through mantras to make this, they make this convection of goods their way, of resources their way, to guarantee it and to make it fluid and to guarantee the flow at all times. And so that requires a very, very elaborate rhetoric, and to be fine-tuned and to change according to circumstances and so on. And so when I was seeing that the old Marxist story of workers versus industrialists was obsolete, they replaced it with this thing, and it came by way of France. And the Americans saw it, very intelligently saw that, and borrowed it and stole it and re-elaborated it, and by also inviting one of these thinkers that spoke this new idiom in the 70s, that was Foucault, and so on. So in a nutshell, what does it do? They have this idea that what they don't want, social justice means everybody at the bottom, or especially bottom and middle class, unite to, in a sense, really minimize the parasitical encroachment of the upper elites. That's what it is. And this requires a movement led by the middle class, the middle stratum. This was Veblen's message. Engineers, he believed in scientists, but the educated core of leading society into a more peaceful, organized, decentralized way, and so on, which goes completely against what we have. And it is very much driven by universal and a coherent aggregation of all peoples for a common project of love. So the best way, and it seems it worked beautifully, and we can see its results in the last 35 years, is to make sure that none of this would work. So you got to break it and drive wedges into it. And so they did that with diversity. So wait a minute, aggregate people. No, you can't do that. We're all different. Your skin color is different, your sexual orientation is different, and that means that that you cannot possibly communicate a woman with a different color of skin from a man with an opposite color of skin. That's just words that just don't communicate. So they started with this thing. And they started to driving wedges, creating, under the guise of a compassionate outlook, in this of former exploitation. So it was beautifully done, because they leveraged true injustices that were committed, and they somehow harnessed them to their own thing, which was not about doing any good or making people come together, but it was about dividing them further for their own good, because we don't want people to start thinking about how the economy is organized and then rebel and eject us from our seats. So let's try and divide them. So the usual divide and conquer. And so start telling them that if you are from one ethnic group, especially one persecuted ethnic group, you should always hate those that come from, and so on and so forth. Now we see the results that we have. So everybody looks at each other with, askance and with doubts and oh my God, what will I say? Will it hurt? Will it offend? They created a psychotic climate, and so the results are before our eyes, I think. And so they've done this, and this Foucault was the one who originally had come up with the idea that the world is not anymore divided, should not be looked as something between workers and industrialists, but between a disciplinary. And this is what I was going to say. This discourse has had a tremendous, its greatest strength, and it's an enormous strength. It's not so much the ability of its prophets like Foucault, the man who inspired him, about whom I'll talk in a moment. It's about the fact, and this is their strength, and it is an enormous strength, that of all, because I see human societies as beehives or termitaries. I say that if we derive analogies from the insect world, we get a lot more insight sociologically about what we are. I see all groups of different termitaries or different ant heaps. And there's no doubt, and they've created this story saying, well, there's the white people, and they're really bad. And it's the white people saying that about themselves, which is another masterpiece. They're really bad, and they are so bad that everybody else is good, right? And so now we're going to teach you that white people are bad and non-white is good. And so now we come to this thing, which is really weird. And so you see whites talking bad about themselves, but not really meaning it. They've created this psychodrama that's insane. But the truth is, I see no ant heap as being good. They're all predatory, they're all violent, and they're all hierarchical and parasitical. All of them, white or non-white. But what's true about the postmodern outlook is that of all the ant heaps, we the whites have been so far the most violent, the most ferociously determined to wage power. And along with that, yes, develop great arts and sciences, true, top, and of course you can't say that, it would be considered racist to say, but the arts and science of the West, technologically at least, is recognized as being that the Western anthill has developed that. But on the other hand, along with that, they are the ones with the greatest capacity for devastation and the most ferociously determined to rule. And that's true. And in a sense, there's truth in that. They are the worst. We, the whites, are the worst. But historically, again, which doesn't make the others nice or good. They're not. We're just worse than they are. But the book of Veblen reminds us that there is a fight within that nasty ant heap that is us, that there is a 20% that doesn't want it that way, that still cherishes the arts and sciences that we have, but refuses the politics of domination. And some people say to us, well, it doesn't work. You're either all of it or nothing. And so if you are committed to all of it, the great arts and sciences come with the Holocaust, and as such, you are an evil breed. Well, I don't think so. I think that the most important thing that there is for us, there was, I don't know if anymore, that there is resistance and dissidence within the core of the white ant heap, the Western ant heap. There's a group of us that says we're capable of great things, and we reject completely the violence that went along with it. Can we save it? So this is a thing. Yeah. So Foucault, to come to your question, was a hack, a very capable hack, a pure academic who came up with this idea. Says, okay, it's no longer about the employer and the workers. It's about a group of people in white robes, the clinicians, the scientific observer, like this kind of evil caste of technicians and doctors and engineers and technocrats of organized death, versus the impulse of life, the madness, some kind of a luciferic pleasure of the blood and of rebellion and of just setting the world ablaze, which has then been often taught in university courses in a completely misleading way, passing off Foucault as an advocate of love and compassion versus what he called the disciplinarian state, this technocratic structure, which was not at all the case. Foucault was saying that the technocratic structure was an aberration of power, was just an edifice of steel and glass, which had taken the place of what used to be the keyword here is sovereign, the sovereign rights of kings who used to get rid of opposition through decapitations or horrible execution, which Foucault said he condemned. He actually admired and appreciated. So it is a pan and a celebration of violence itself, but of an old, you could say, traditional, sovereign, anti-modern way. So the Americans took all this, kind of tried to hide this part a little bit and succeeded, but it's crazy because if you read the book, how can you not see it? But people don't read books. They just get the stripped down version from their teachers. They got that, and they articulated it into what Foucault had articulated as a fight between the May 68 French rebellion of the youth against the cops of de Gaulle and the system. The Americans said, we're going to articulate this as a kind of a race thing. All right, so there's the evil white Nixon administration on the one hand, and all the suppressed voices of the non-white world, and that was the beginning of the putting together this dialectic of diversity and race clashing that we now have. And I always say, if you're in a country that respects others and doesn't really care about race and where there is no racism, you wouldn't talk about it. And at all, because, or even about sex, sexual management, orientation. I don't know. I belong to those people who never really care. So, oh, that person does this. I don't care. I don't know what the person does. So long as this person, so long as this person is respectful and embraces love and cooperation, that's great. And then the rest is none of my business and so on. And a lot of us say, yeah, of course, me too. But that's not the game here. The game is to pit us one against the other and create this state of tension from which they profit, of course. And in the end, they have succeeded. So
I think the where your work on this is brilliant and moves forward other great prognosticators of this century is that this new Foucaultian politics of diversity has become, again, an ideology of tyranny. And the word ideology can almost be transposed with religion. And it's been my allegation when reading your work that when you trace it back from Foucault, and we'll mention the name George Bataille, that we can, if we trace it back to its correct roots, we can more clearly see how it's manifesting itself in our time, especially in the recent months with censorship and so forth, as a new religion. So this connection to George Bataille is very interesting. If you can describe who he is and his whole import.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to say, yes, going back briefly to racism, I think that racism has never been stronger as it is now. As in, the more you talk about it in these terms, the more it is a sign that the old elite hasn't overcome its racist bent in the least. Right. Actually, I think it has never felt any more superior and in power than now, and hence the turning the screw as much as possible on this, respect. I think that its disrespect of the others has never been so high as it is now.
Yeah.
And it's reflected in the rhetoric. Yeah. So Foucault, and he created this really, and I got to give it to him. I really, as an intellectual figure, I absolutely detest him. And so, but I have to recognize that he's the one who's really big on the new, the biopower. Yeah. He had foreseen that in the future.
Sure.
He was dead right. I mean, on the money, and he nailed it completely. And in the future, he said, in this world of disciplinarians versus the criminals, the rebels, the dropouts, in this never-ending war between them. So this is how, because in the old Marxian things that the workers and the slaves will rise and then will topple the system and create a dictatorship of the proletariat. Then they change. Well, Foucault was different. He says there's none of that. It's going to be an endless fight. It's pretty much the movie The Matrix, right? Mm-hmm. The machines on the one hand, and then these rebels that are just fighting with the fists and skin in this never-ending saga. And he also insisted and wrote a lot about how in the future the dystopia will be run by health officials. Yeah. And so it's come.
It's come. It is come. Right.
It is come. No, it's frightening. We were just also with some in our groups. We were just, we've been watching these dystopian movies for a year. Like, oh well, the children of our children will see this. No, we got to see it. It's happened. And and so Foucault he did that. So he also created a very funky and cool terminology. The biopower, biometrics, the microphysics of power. I don't know. He created a really colorful terminology. He improved on the metaphors of the master he plagiarized. I'll come to him in a second. And also he had that beautiful vignette about that the Velázquez paintings. Because the main thing of why he was so much endorsed, he says that there is no centrality in power, right?
Right.
That's the thing. Power, there's no power. There's no center of power. What do you mean there's no center of power? Everything is centralized. No, says Foucault. If you don't get this from an intellectual viewpoint, you're just some kind of a simpleton, a moron who cannot reason in nonlinear terms. Power is diffused all around. It's at the margin, and again, right? Empowered masses, the criminals, they are power. And he gives this the Velázquez painting because it's as we know, like when it was La Meninas that it's from the viewpoint of the king and queen who are posing for the painter, and you can only see them in a reflection of some kind of circular mirror at the end of the room. And
what's the name of the painting, Guido?
I think La Meninas.
Okay, gotcha. You said it, yes.
Velázquez, if I'm not mistaken, one of Velázquez's paintings, and Foucault says that's a representation of what power really is. There is no king, there is no queen. There's just a sensation that they're there, and power reigns through its absence. And Velázquez captured that by seeing just the painting from the viewpoint of the king and queen who are not there, faintly reflected in this mirror in the end. And so
I had never heard of that vignette.
Yeah. What can I say? Brilliant. For as much as I detest him, I just have, has to be brilliant. Well, the story, completely. Power is not centralized. Power is the center.
Yeah.
And you learn this. You don't have to go at high levels of government to see how it works. So he was a complete mystagogue and mystifier, and is being erected into a god and a saint. And he is so not himself, so great and so huge in American academia that he almost like some kind of an etherical figure. He's kind of evanesced because people don't even know who he is, but his lingo is in everybody's mouths. So what if
I like the phrase that he's evanesced.
Well, you talk to a modern sociology.
Yeah, 100%.
I'm sure, but in a few years, this was happening a few years ago. Foucault, they're going to go, I know, but they were reading him much more years past. But they have done the work of indoctrination so well that you don't need to know who he is anymore. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I said, well, Foucault. Well, I happen to have read Bataille because I've read Bataille's Economics, and I said, it's called The Accursed Share. It's a great book. And Bataille was...
and make sure you weave into this scarcity versus surplus, too, as a little parenthetical, right?
Well,
like power and economics, I think it's a crucial one.
Yeah, excellent point. So I had read Bataille. So when I heard the teachers in academia talk about Foucault, I didn't know Foucault at all. But I said, well, give me a break. This is like completely ripped off out of Foucault. And I just raised my hand. I said, well, out of Bataille. And I just say, well, but what about Bataille? And then the people say, who? So I said, okay, all right. And so that I started, okay, let me do the genealogy, to use the Foucauldian term. And then, what Foucault did, not that I can prove it, but I just give the text in my book and said to the reader, see it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There's a second volume of the complete works of Bataille, where Bataille was a writer, to make it, he was a surrealist artist, basically, former seminarian who, so religious type, former seminarian who had a vision and decided that the way of God was the wrong one, and instead he just took the way of the non-God, and which eventually was some kind of modern, very personal reinvention of a satanic cult. It really was, and he says so himself. It's a kind of a Dionysus Redivivus cult that should have entailed also human sacrifice. He was
at least he had the courage of his convictions, right?
Oh, completely. And even people was allegedly they even found somebody really willing to let himself be immolated, but not somebody willing to immolate him.
Yeah.
So there were some kind of, they didn't really
take one for the team.
Yeah, they didn't have, that kind of old sovereign guts that the old types that he so admired had. But so he was, really interested by the Aztecs, had really passionate about Mussolini and his fascists. Didn't like Hitler and the Nazis. Thought they were petty bourgeois. Anyway, a really sulfurous figure. I think definitely, I would just say a villain, intellectually and sentimentally speaking, but an absolute genius and a great, amazing sociologist. So I read pretty much it all, learned a tremendous amount of things from him, and in I think the second volume of his collected works, he set up a group, an informal group of sociology in Paris in the late 30s, where invited notorious anthropologists to discuss the things that interest him, the nature of violence, cult and religious associated with violence. For him, it was a big thing, and he was right. The way he was asking the right questions. He said, forget about the good and nurture and love, but think about the evil, the way in which we kill one another, the way it's ritualized, the way the way men rape, and how it's done. There is a willing agency to it all. It's just not a random thing. It is, or the way the Aztecs sacrifice. There is a choreography. There is a panoply of rituals and liturgies that is not random. What is it? And correctly so. And so he said, and how do we reconcile this with love and procreation and nurture? So he was trying to synthesize on this, and by recreating a cult of love and destruction, a dualistic. He never really succeeded, but he addressed those issues and wrote some amazing sociology in the process. So, and in these conferences that he held, he also briefly sketched this outline of how we went from the true sovereign way of ruling, which was that of the Aztecs in a way, down to the modern monarchies and crowns and royal systems, which were some kind of a first, I should say, a first perversion of the original intent, because then the violence was no longer accepted in the community as it was with the Aztecs, but was just thrust outwards in the forms of dynastic wars. So violence was there, but it was packaged and thrown out. And then there was the second stage, which was, he says, was a contamination and a corruption of the original true Aztec pure state, down to the modern thing, which is the technocratic apparatus, which for him was just this aseptic, anesthetized hoax.
I see it as some combination of a transmogrification of the steel of the old dynastic sword to silicon chips and steel office buildings, right?
Exactly right. Or as Foucault would say, or a Foucauldian argument would be a lethal injection, right?
Okay, yeah.
You will die, but you will die injected, and even the electric chair was considered not Puritan enough, because you would hear the smell of the burnt flesh, and the victim would secrete and evacuate, and all of these things, all the secretions of the body. The Puritan is horrified, much more by them than by act of the execution.
Right.
That's where the Foucauldian, it's look at the hypocrisy. They still want to fry the person, but they don't want to see the excrements.
Yeah.
And whereas in the olden days, in the beginning of the book of Foucault on punishment, there's a description, which was not even Foucault's, about how they used to kill a regicide. And first they open his chest, and they put the lead in it, and then they dismembered it. It was just like, even the execution of a regicide was just an extremely elaborate evil thing. And Foucault and people think when you read those first pages, like Foucault is denouncing it. He's not. He's saying this is the way it was, and this was good. It's the way we're doing it now that is just, as you said, a transmogrification, and a just like it's a mock up of what it was, of the sovereign beauty of it. So, and Foucault, Bataille calls this the transition to power.
Yeah.
And Foucault doesn't even change it. Power, knowledge, and so he steals it wholesale. True, in Bataille, it's more of an intuition. It's not fully developed, but it's completely there.
Yeah.
So as it often happens, these hacks who were capable enough but not imaginative like these other geniuses took the idea, ran with it, and became famous. But then didn't enjoy his fame long enough because he will die young enough. But although in his early 50s, mid 50s or something, but not after enjoying a tremendous idolization in the Californian campuses, even though his career had run out of steam.
And that's Foucault and not Bataille. Yeah.
That's Foucault.
Right. So then, and your book too, your book seems to then go from Bataille, again, foundations in Dionysian, I'm going to say religion, sovereignty. It get kind of, reshaped. And then even beyond Foucault, we find a genealogy that you trace that has its neoconservative wing, and then it's more traditional. When we use the term cultural Marxism, that's why I think your work is good. We can kind of free ourselves from that phrase that carries some descriptive power, but I think it's used to carry more water than it can. But so you have kind of the left wing version, and then the right wing neoconservative. Two wings on the same bird of prey, right? And we probably don't have time to go into the whole genealogy, but if you want to kind of give people the layout so they can even buy the book, and we'll talk about that at the end too, how to get your writings.
Yeah, no, in the end, it's not so much to go into details of the book, but I realize by finding the way that it has two wings, that there are people on the right that are believing what those allegedly on the left believe too. It's the similarities are there, even though they seem to be at locking horns over everything. Yeah, it's just in the end, it's my pessimistic conclusion that despite some superficial things, it's much like it was in the Cold War. As I was saying, we were seeing this was much truer in Europe than it was in the States, but you had some of that. We were seeing people in my generation were seeing parents and their uncles. Some of them were with the communists, and the others were with the Christian Democrats and the liberals at each other's throats for a whole decade. And they were the same people and the same standards. And then when the wall came down, everybody just didn't know what they had been doing. So which shows also the powers of hypnotizations, of hypnotizing folk about stuff that don't exist. With regard to this, so it's a realization in the end that despite these superficial differences, everybody believes in violence.
Yeah. Can you give a little bit of a genealogy of some of the names on the right? Because again, I find, especially with a lot of young men right now on college campuses, they're being taught to look at everything from this term cultural Marxism. So it's the right kind of condemning the left. But you might say to the right wing of this genealogy, they should clean their room. Who are some of these people you trace, and they can find it in the book? What are some of the names that are on the right?
Well, a lot of the names that are on the right are people that have inspired all the rhetoric of the post 9/11 neoconservative administrations of Bush. And you notice this in the universities, even though they say left and right, but when that new post 9/11 consensus came, they were all in the same boat, not questioning anything. But not that you had to question even the narrative of 9/11, God forbid, but at least oppose the wars. And I was shocked. Because on the left, I didn't hear anybody say anything. They were, Actually, it was even worse. That article came out from Laura Bush, says we're going to Afghanistan to liberate the Afghani.
That was the best, right?
I thought I'm going to faint. This is, and yet nobody was laughing. And so I thought, okay, I get it. You're all together in this. It's like it's your old alliance, and it's forged and it's strong. You're both for militarism, the complaint of the feminists was that there were not enough jet fighter pilots,
Mm-hmm.
which was a thing so heinous and so horrible to hear. First of all, because of course, it takes a lot of skill to drive a jet to fly a jet fighter. But if you think about it, it is the most cowardly way of fighting. Of dropping bombs from the air on defenseless targets, and not only do you kill allegedly enemy targets, but you kill everything in radius of miles.
Of course, yeah.
And they were complaining because, and they think that having more female jet fighters was just a win-win for womanhood.
Yeah.
I thought it's just hopeless. It's just hopeless.
How about this? If you don't mind, if we, because I still want to switch to another kind of tale that you tell too, but bringing this one to a conclusion, and there'll be overlaps. We have this movement that we've been describing, where kind of both sides of the political spectrum embrace violence, and yet you did a stint teaching at the Gregorian Pontifical University in Rome, and I'm Catholic. I work in Catholic campus ministry. I've worked for the church, and you have some close ties to the Vatican and so forth. What has been in your book on New Directions in Catholic Social and Political Thought? You edited a tremendous book. I reviewed it at Front Porch Republic. You have a chapter called The Political Scripting of Jesus. Can you say a little bit about how the church has done kind of combating this, where it's done good, where it's done bad? Maybe there's none of each. I don't know.
In that monograph, I wanted to talk about what is the political meaning of the Gospels, really. And I did it through some of the, what is Jesus politically? And that story, whether you believe it or not. But the story is central in any sense. And I did it through the condemnations that the Vatican issued against some of its theologians, 3 of them. So one of them was slapped on the wrist and silenced. I forget now the details of the condemnation for suggesting that Jesus was a Marxist rebel, South American style. And the reason this came from the vicissitudes in El Salvador, which had led to a Holocaust. I mean, and tens of thousands of
Right.
An extraordinary massacre. And this was under John Paul II, and I guess this was a Jesuit priest who...
I think it was John Sobrino, right?
Sobrino, yeah. Who just decided, who was just obviously, I don't even know how it is, anguished or just destroyed by what he saw, and wrote this, as a theologian, wrote this book portraying Jesus as some kind of a Marxist leader, over Marxist, just campesino, pro-peasant leader who leads the masses against the exploiters, and he was scolded for doing that. I completely sympathized with that episode, and I thought that apparently it seems that Rome left this part of the church alone, and but then you wonder what was the point of it all, and whether, despite the abominable injustices that these people were suffering at the hands of the plantation owners who were fully supported by the states, whether it was worthwhile rebel at all, because this led to so much suffering and blood, and nothing changed after 10 years of civil war. So I don't know. I don't judge it, and don't utter any kind of conclusions about it. All the more so as I'm by no means an expert on this subject. I just look at what he wrote, and I just have doubts. And not that I say that Rome was right in condemning him, but I have doubts that one could see Jesus as a revolutionary rebel, even if you want to see that. But in the end, I guess my question was, why do we even need the Jesus myth to protest against injustice? Why don't, in a sense, the other two cases were completely different, and they were about 2 American priests who some kind distorted the traditional theological description of Jesus, and some kind of made it more appealing to the politics of diversity. So that And so they turn into, one of them was making Jesus more some kind of an ethnic figure, who was more into the ethnic thing. So more into that compartmentalized, my ethnicity is, in a sense, different from yours, so in a sense, better than yours. And so that divisive thing. That part is a different phenomenon. And there was 2 priests that did that. And I guess there was, I see some kind of transformation of the church, which for good or for ill, but it's morphing more and more into a regional branch of the United States. The Catholic Church is.
The Catholic Church as a regional branch of the United States. That's a bombshell.
Of the great Anglo-American commonwealth. Yeah,
Yeah.
they realize that they're too weak, that they have failed, that their scandals have given them the coup de grace completely, and also that they don't have the ideas and the intellectual and spiritual stamina to propose anything in alternative. And it seems that an orientation within the church has just resigned itself and surrendered to the idea that they're better just, sell their goodwill and their industrial structure to a more powerful corporation. And that's what's happening, I think. And so one way of showing that you come with gifts is that you say, we're ready to rescript the gospel in a way that you like. More PC, more politics of diversity. We'll just do whatever you tell us to do. And so
I almost feel people falling out of their chair as they kind of hear this,
Well, I mean, I just say, well, then.
Well, you're giving words to something that a lot of us kind of suspect, but don't have the courage. If we love our institution, we've never tried to give it that type of visual, Well,
but I mean, look at the church. I mean, you go to Rome and it says, where are the Catholic intellectuals? There are none. And everything is just subcontracted, and all the important disciplines, it's just subcontracted, or that's just, I was seeing this in the Gregorian, not to mention in American universities, formerly Jesuit, where that thing has been surrendered. How there is this almost the alacrity and a ferocious desire of conforming to the latest trends. So, not wanting to go into the politics of diversity again, but you look at economics, and you think economics would be you think that the church would want to say something. Not at all. Actually, I remember it got really mad at me for not teaching the traditional macroeconomics, the traditional way. I mean, which are things that in principle macroeconomics teaches nothing. I don't want to go into what macroeconomics is, but it is a religious, mathematized rhetoric that preaches that we live in a world of scarcity, which is like exactly the opposite of what the gospel says. And so I was just telling that to the chief deans and principals and priests at the Gregorian. Says, well, you can't teach this stuff. It goes against what you preach.
It's economics as if the story of the lilies of the field and the birds of the air was not true. Yeah.
That one. Yeah. So you can't do that. And then they were incensed and whatever. So, yeah. So in the light of all this, what do you expect? So it's obvious. I mean, and it's even more disquieting because these guys that are writing these books where they're changing everything to please the modern rhetoric of the Anglo-American administrations, they're doing all this also in a self-serving way. Just like managers from a corporation that's been bought by a bigger one are just pleading with the CEOs not to fire them, right? They say, hey, no, we're your new underlings. Leave us here, though. We guarantee continuity. We know the flocks, and that's what they're doing. They're securing. They do. They want to stay in charge, but with a new boss. And I think I've been having some talks with some really insightful friends that are still inside, and it seems to be. And for me, this was manifest, but I was not deep into the secret of the church princes enough to say. But anyway, regardless whether one is deep inside or not, this seems to be the development.
That is something else. Now, thanks for sharing that. How about and I think I'm already foreseeing the need for another one of these at some point. But I do want you, because we got to mention the Conjuring Hitler book, and this interview is being yoked to a profile piece I'm doing for you. on your work at Front Porch Republic. I've kind of wanted to make it known, and that's kind of how we met. But your view of geopolitics, I'm looking at a book of yours and thinking about it, the Conjuring Hitler book. I've got a copy behind me. And when people first hear the thesis, or maybe even when you first wrote it, utterly shocking, and you can describe that. But in our time, in the age of color revolutions, regime change operations, in one sense, tell me how much you agree, what you're doing is with that marvelous work of history. And I've heard you say that, like, if people come prepared to debate kind of live and not alter it after, you debate anybody about the facts anytime or anywhere. But you're taking this American geopolitical game of fomenting our Frankenstein monsters in, say, the Middle East, and all of a sudden they come back to bite us in the form of Al-Qaeda, or this geopolitical game of color revolutions, creating chaos in an economy such that reactionary forces might surface that we can then use to do our geopolitical bidding against big monsters like Russia and so forth. You're just telling that story much earlier than other people would have started telling that story. That's one way of describing that book. I'm going to turn it over to you.
I think I've been kind of oscillating on this thing, and but a little bit. But I think that I don't know if I came upon this. I don't think it was my thought, but I read at a certain point. I read somewhere, Geopolitics died in 1945, and I think that's the case because I wanted to some kind of put myself in a state where I would believe that Russia is still the enemy, but Russia is not the enemy. Russia plays along. Russia never was the enemy in any sense. And even in my book, Conjuring Hitler, she was actually one of the greatest allies. And so I think that ever since in 45, the Anglo-American commonwealth won the world. There remain areas where they were not really worried about, but it was more a question of how to manage them in the future, which were Russia to a certain extent and China. But we saw what happened. I mean, China now is doing what. So I think the most important thing we have is Orwell, right? The post. So now it's all a game. So now that the Brits had a plan, which took them 50 years to enact, to get rid of all the real competitors they had. So it was the competing crowns. So they got rid of the Russians, they got rid of the Central Powers, the German and Austrians. And with that, they also gave the first big blow to the church, because we know with Benedict XV, it wasn't happy after World War I, because the Germans and the Austrians were his divisions. And then gave the coup de grace with the church, and the church was the last thing, because it was this deterritorialized empire of 1 billion souls. And now I think it's been hollowed out and it's done. So that was their plan. So, but technically, aside from the church, which was already in their pocket, because as we know with Pius XII, there were a lot of secrets and a lot of guilt that wasn't properly handled in the right channels, by the right channels in the right places, it was done. So after that, Orwell books is great and has never ceased, the book within the book, not the story of Winston Smith itself, but that it's a game where we need fake enemies to keep it going. Apparently, it's essential for the elites to keep power, because if there weren't these things going on, it would be a problem for them. Maybe because people would relax, and then when they relax, they start thinking, and when they start thinking, they start to question how things are. So there always have to be a state of uncertainty and fear, and warmongering and an enemy, as we know. So they did that with the Russians. The Russians played along, just like a movie extra. And then I think that circus unraveled, and as we know, and we had those 10 years that were not bad, the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. Where they're still reorganizing. We could smell it. It was something, because they still hadn't thought about Act 2. Act 2 came, and with it, a new change of scenario. They did this Middle Eastern thing. I believe it. I was a Fulbright scholar to the Middle East. I went and talked and interviewed and taught at a university to realize that this clash of civilization was just a fabrication. In the Middle East, I saw nothing.
The Samuel Huntington clash of civilizations is a fabrication. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a joke. And him and Bernard Lewis, the great screenwriters of this Islamic thing.
Screenwriters.
Yeah, screenwriters. It's run
Yeah.
out of steam. It was a good show, very expensive, decent show. Even no, actually, no, it was not. It was even worse than the Russian show, which was a very bad one. And if you go there, what you'll see is poor countries completely on the defensive, culturally meaningless. They have nothing. And you could see that for all those, I keep saying this image, I keep talking about these satellite dishes on the rooftops of Damascus. It's all satellite dishes. So it's worlds that are just with their ears pointed at what the West is doing, right? Dreaming of the West. And nothing was more on the defensive than Islam itself. Just it was a force of conservation, of conservatism that kept this world that is vanishing together. So they made that. It was a giant production. Now that run out of steam. You could see this from the quality of the movies too. The movies about jihadist threats never really made anybody scared, and also movies about the Cold War and the spies never really, except for the Manchurian Candidate, it wasn't about Russia at all anyway. You can also see from the quality of the movies how fake the thing was, and so now in China also, I always say the 1972 trip of Nixon, visionary. Nixon, probably the great emperor America has ever had. And now China's been inducted into playing the role that China used to have as the friend enemy.
They say frenemy now, frenemy.
No, complete friend.
Yeah. Right.
Complete friend.
Okay.
China was nothing before it was inducted into the World Trade Organization by the States as their godfather in 2001, 2001. And so how could it possibly be the enemy?
So funny. How about this? I want to make clear that your book, Conjuring Hitler, does not mean the Anglo-American Empire chose Adolf Hitler, but can you kind of give a thumbnail sketch of, because people might be nervous reading it, but it's really just a story of geopolitics.
Yeah, no, I think, well, first of all, let's say it's still a deep mystery. There are things that that remain mysterious. I don't know, like, who was Hitler really? He's an enigma to me. Am I saying that he was chosen like a puppet and trained and indoctrinated? No, not at all. That's not what I said. I don't know how he came about. We've read so many books about it, but it's still strange. And the speculation is what would have happened had Hitler been admitted at the art school, because and probably they would have found another one. Who knows? Another one of these pipers. The thing is, though, that I rely on Veblen again, who wrote an amazing book about Imperial Germany and the industrial system, the 1915 book, and a prophecy he made, which are very much two of the basic pillars and buttresses of the book. So I'm not just making things up.
Sure.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I could, but I don't. It's special enough for that book. And where Veblen reviews a book of Keynes on the consequences of the peace, of how the Germans were allegedly humiliated at Versailles. And he says, so Keynes was some kind of the Krugman of the day, the really fancy economists who were really super, always at the center of things. Or you'd say Krugman wishes he were the Keynes of today. But anyway, and Veblen, this unknown sage writing this review from, I forget what journal, he says Keynes had a really good vantage point, but apparently understood nothing of what he was there for. And had he had a working cell in his brain, he would have figured out that this wasn't about humiliating anybody or to punish the Germans at all, because they didn't sequester their financial wealth. So he goes through a political economy explanation, brilliant, and then he issues his prophecy at the end. He says what they're doing. And Veblen had made a little mistake, a little romanticizing mistake. He had thought that the revolution in Russia was for real. And he himself, being so disgusted with the system that he was seeing emerge of the second industrial divide and the end of the Socialist Party in America and the crushing of the international workers of the world, he was very pro-anarchist unions and so on, thought that in Russia, finally they had Eden. He was wrong, but nevertheless, that didn't really derail his vision that much. He said what they're doing is that they are covering the German elites. They are not hampering them, and they're allowing them to reform, regroup, put back together a strong revanchist movement that will come out reinforced by radicalism on the right, speaking of electoral tactics, which they will launch against Russia.
Yeah. So Veblen, in what year did he write that, Guido?
1920.
So he saw in 1920 that there was a movement here to radicalize a group to turn against another country and get destroyed in the interim.
He thought it was aimed at Russia,
yeah.
But in fact, in a sense, it was. But Russia was complicit. It was a plan to destroy Germany itself.
Right. Yeah.
But the dynamics he foresaw. Not only that, I provide that story, and then in his book on the German dynasties, he gives a portrait of a typical German piper that he came up with after reading so much about Anabaptism and all the strange religious, fervent, crazy movements that have emerged in German history. And I quote this passage in the book, and it is uncanny and eerie. It seems like he's describing Hitler at his pulpit.
Yeah.
This was in 1915, where Hitler was just a front soldier, unknown completely. And
again, a religious phenomenon.
Yeah, yes, and so in a sense, you need Adolf Hitler, him. It could have been there were the seeds and the forces to lead this. It would have been they were there. With Veblen alone, you see that, and so then you put the pieces together, and the story that emerges is not what they tell you in the schools, but that's another story.
Yeah. How about this? Jumping a little bit and looking towards another time to maybe explore some other questions in more detail. I think you're unique now because you're not just a diagnostician of ailments. You're one of the few people who, and maybe this is why I was first drawn to your work on perishable currency, that you talk about a different way of doing things. So I've talked about that other genealogy of pacifism, compassion, justice, and brotherhood and fraternity. But in addition, you'll get as involved as to come up with concrete plans for a rejuvenation of communities. In your book, New Directions on Catholic Social and Political Thought, Palgrave Macmillan was the publisher of that, Guido?
Yeah, yes.
Yep. You actually have a chapter called The Blueprint. With, say, 5 or 6 minutes remaining, maybe tie in what you, having written that book a few years ago, what do you think's going on now, and what do you think is something that people could do in this time, with definitely tying into some of your concrete economic ideas?
Yeah, I put together a group of friends that we had at the time, and we wrote this little piece, 4 pages of things that we thought were so important if we were to have a dream situation. And there was some skepticism even within the group. Some of my friends thought, I don't want this to smack too much of social engineering. But it's not social engineering. It's things that we think could just make things better if we were to implement. So we love the idea of seeing free cities, more decentralized things, and then characterized by certain features. One of them having a communal mint, not the banking system that we have, and money being issued as these certificates that have an expiration date, which is a revolutionary notion. So which prevents hoarding and would are more conducive to creation of wealth, and so on and so forth. Along with that was a need to look into biofarming, and also the niceties of the web, of creating groups of exchange via the internet and so on. So it was nothing really ambitious. I mean, nothing too presumptuous or ambitious, but outlining certain things that we would think would make things better, and put people to work, and doing work that is also gratifying. And so we thought decentralization, free money in the sense perishable money, communal mints, biofarming, biodynamic solutions, eating properly, maybe vegetarianism also.
Yeah.
Even I'm not very good with that, but I
nor am I.
But I know it's correct. We should be vegetarians, and so I think that was mentioned. And so yes, and also ways of connecting through these association of mutual exchange on the net for disposing of preventing waste and recycling things. I guess these were the elements that were there.
Yeah.
And so I guess the most important is imagining. And we had also another friend of mine is Richard Veblen, this German economist, who to me in my book is number one, most talented macroeconomist of his generation. And he also
What's his name again?
Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R.
Okay.
And he also had a plan, I remember, to create regional banks in the UK. I don't know what came of that, but the ideas are the same, credit creation. And he also was sympathetic to the idea of a demurrage, namely having an expiration date in the money. So that would be our biggest, our winning horse, we think. How does that figure and how does that stand now? Yeah, not well. No,
I've often seen your economics as somewhat similar to Michael Hudson's, and he has an article making the rounds right now, which I think he's turning into a book. But it's a useful distinction, just like, economics versus power. I'm going to say scarcity versus surplus. But he's making this one between finance capitalism, rent seeking, and industrial capitalism, where political forces can be used to build infrastructure. I wish they were smaller. Do you think there's an alignment there with your own thinking?
Oh yeah, no, I know him. He's extremely talented economist too. Yeah. I didn't read the book, but yes, you mentioned this before, also in connection to Bataille, that we teach economics always from the perspective of scarcity, whereas instead you get the most insights, not just for producing and constructing for the future, but also understanding about a society in a way in which the society expends its surplus. They always make you think that there are never enough resources. And then think of how, actually, the opposite is true. We have so much, we don't know what to do. And you could pretty much understand a lot of the soul and the heart of a society, of what it does with this surplus. And so how much does it put into theaters and hospitals, and how much is it put into armaments? That tells you a lot of things. Yeah. And so it's also another way of diagnosing and looking at the anatomy of the society in which you live. And obviously, they don't want you to do that in economics courses. They wanted to keep it as aseptic and as non-committal and as apoliticized as possible, which is to say, as most politicized as could be. They don't want you to question anything.
Yeah, that's a nice summary of all of it. Things that are supposed to be non-political are so crazily political that we're going to wind up in chains. Yeah.
Completely. You must not, and this is why they don't like you to study history even. Most history classes have been phased out from economics curricula because they might bring you to a position where you might ask questions that you're not supposed to ask.
Yeah. How about some final words or thoughts? Any comments on the scene as it is here in February of 2021?
I don't know. I don't know yet. It's still. We would all need some more time to get a perspective on this. It looks worrisome. Very worried about what's going on.
Can you say where people can get your books? What's the best? How would you introduce? How would you want to recommend to people how to get introduced to your writings?
Well, there's the website, and if you want to, they can write.
I'll make a link to that.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I can send whatever they need, and then there's the books, and if they cannot afford the books, I can send the PDFs. I can send everything. It's
talk about the compassionate, pacifistic tradition.
No, if they're interested, say, of course. I have folks sometimes write to me and say, sure. Happy to send it. If you're so gracious to read it, yes.
Wow, what a great way to end.
That's the least.
Happily married, father of two daughters, living in California. We're going to stay in touch. Thank you so much, Dr. Guido Preparata. And when I finish with my profile piece, I'll send it to you.
Wonderful. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
Yeah, bye-bye now.